So in 18-3, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and its relationship and communication with the anterior and posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus is in our brain, and the hypothalamus is named hypothalamus because it sits below the thalamus, just superior to the midbrain and inferior to the corpus callosum. And the hypothalamus is made up of a bunch of ganglions and nuclei nuclei within that space, and it communicates to the anterior and posterior pituitary, but in two different ways. So before we start talking about the differences in those, let's talk a little bit about the anatomy. So here we have a picture of the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus has this stocky bit called the infundibulum, and that helps hold the anterior and posterior pituitary within the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. And this is really important to understand the anatomy in this space, even though it's really small, and to be able to understand the different parts of the anterior lobe. And so if we zoom into what's going on and the differences in the texture of these two tissues, we can see that the right side, which is a posterior pituitary, looks very different from the anterior pituitary. And that should tell you a little bit about function as well, right? So the right side is actually made up of a bunch of neuronal tissue, versus the left side is made up of a bunch of its own types of cells. And even though it looks like in this picture they're both connected directly to the hypothalamus, only the posterior pituitary actually has a direct connection to the hypothalamus via neurons, versus the anterior pituitary, which you can see in this pink shade, kind of like wraps itself around the infundibulum, and it's actually going to share a blood supply with the hypothalamus. So in order to differentiate these on a slide, we would say that the tissues in the anterior pituitary lobe are separated from the posterior pituitary lobe via the pars intermedia. And you can also tell a difference of the slides where the pars tuberalis is, which you can see identified here on the slide. So the pars tuberalis is what shares space with the infundibulum, or is part of the infundibulum, to help hold and anchor the anterior pituitary where it is. Okay. So in the next couple pictures, these shouldn't be in your notes because I just didn't want to waste some space for you for printing. I just kind of want to show you and orient you with where we're talking. So here's a picture of the sphenoid bone on the left, and the middle picture on the left is an anterior superior view, so you're looking like top down, as you can see in the picture on the right. And the picture in the middle, we're actually looking at a posterior to inferior view, so you can see where that infundibulum would sit right there in the center. You can see the sella turcica, and then you can see the two right on midline, and you can see right behind that, that's where the posterior pituitary would sit. And so then in this picture I highlighted the sphenoid bone so we can see the sella turcica, and right where that infundibulum would be carrying and holding that anterior and posterior pituitary gland. So it's pretty central. It's in the middle of the brain. It's going to be surrounded by a bunch of vascularization, which is super important in terms of how this thing's going to communicate with the rest of the body. Here's a picture of the actual posterior pituitary. You can see the infundibulum is that green stalk, and then that pituitary gland is really small but sandwiched right there in the sella turcica. And then here's another view of it, again in green, tagged in green, so a lateral view of this, and a better view of tagging both its connection with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So hopefully those are helpful. I'm not going to use these as part of the exam. I'm trying to orient everyone with where we're talking. So again, it's tagged in green here, and I did this so that we could talk about the vasculature around it. So I kept the eyeballs there for reference, not to be creepy, but for reference. And we can see the infundibulum in green, and inferior to that is the pituitary gland, and superior to that is the hypothalamus. And you can see that the internal carotid arteries are right next to it. Those are those big arteries right next to it. And then those internal carotids go down and mesh with the common carotids and then the subclavian arteries. So that's a really, really big artery to be really, really close to such a small, important structure. Here I added some more blood vessels, and also the cavernous sinus surrounding the infundibulum, just to show you again that there's a lot of blood supply, a lot of vasculature in this area. Even though it's a really small organ, we're producing a lot of really important hormones, and they have to get somewhere somehow, so we're going to use the vasculature here. Same thing here, just another view. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Continuing on with the cartoonistic depiction, so here, this is a picture from your book. We're going to talk about each of these individually. So let's start with the posterior pituitary, which is in green here. So the hypothalamus is going to have its nuclei, and those nuclei are going to produce hormones or have axons coming directly out of those neurons. So you can see in purple and in that like reddish orange color, we are either directly secreting out hormones or we have axons coming out of them. So then in green, you can see how we have those cell bodies starting in the hypothalamus and the axons projecting down into the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland or the posterior pituitary gland. You can call it either way. And then those axon terminals end in the posterior pituitary, and then that's where we're going to actually release those hormones from. So it's not that the posterior pituitary is creating any hormones, except the posterior pituitary is where those hormones that were created by the hypothalamus are going to be secreted from. Okay, the anterior pituitary, we have those nuclei in the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to make some hormones, and then those hormones are going to get dumped into the bloodstream, and we'll talk about specifically where in the bloodstream. And then that goes directly to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary picks up those hormones, and based off of what hormone that was, we'll decide what hormone to create. And then those hormones will leave the anterior pituitary and go to wherever they need to go. In addition, the hypothalamus also has a direct neuronal control of the adrenal medulla as part of the adrenal gland. The adrenal glands sit just superior to the kidneys. So this is quite a long distance for it to travel, which is pretty impressive. So the hypothalamus has these cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and then the axons extend all the way down to the medulla, not the cortex, but the medulla of the adrenal glands, and then that's where we're actually secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine from. All right, so how in the world am I supposed to know all of this, and what's getting secreted what, and why do I care? We'll get to that. Don't panic. Don't worry. But for now, let's just go ahead and draw out over here on the right kind of a flow chart as we get to this. So if we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to talk to the posterior pituitary directly. So I'm going to draw lines directly to the posterior pituitary. And then the posterior pituitary is going to secrete some hormones. It's going to secrete 2 hormones. Versus the hypothalamus is going to talk to the anterior pituitary, but in order to talk to the anterior pituitary, it's going to have to secrete 6 different types of hormones. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then those are going to talk to the anterior pituitary, and then the anterior pituitary is going to secrete 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different hormones. Okay, so we'll come back to this and we'll talk about what those are. Okay, so how does the how does the hypothalamus, again, in more detail, how does it talk to the anterior and posterior pituitary? So for the anterior pituitary, you can see we have all of these blue capillary beds. And we actually have 2 capillary beds, one superior and one inferior. And this is actually called the hypophyseal portal system. So what's a portal system? A portal system is where we have both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood flowing around. And so let me write this down, because we'll talk about other portal systems as we go through this class. So we have both deoxygenated and oxygenated blood, number 1. Number 2, we have really, really slow blood flow. And the whole point of that is to allow the blood to absorb as much of the hormones, in this case, as possible. So we're going to slow down the blood as much as possible, allow for as much hormone to dump into the blood as possible, and then we'll allow the blood to leave and go to wherever it needs to go. Okay, so here we have the hypophyseal. So hypophysis is another word for hypothalamus. Hypothesis. Not another word for, it's another word for pituitary gland. So that's why, and you don't need to know that, you can call it either way. Your book sticks to anterior and posterior pituitary, but there are some references to hypophysis. So this is why it's called the hypophyseal portal system, because it's the pituitary gland's portal system. Okay, and so here we have two capillary beds, one superior and one inferior. So the hypothalamus will dump hormones into the superior capillary bed and then dump it into the inferior capillary bed, and then the capillary bed in the next to the anterior lobe will dump those hormones into the anterior pituitary cells, and then those cells will respond by making another hormone, and then those eventually exit and travel through the rest of the bloodstream. And then next to all of this, we also see the cell bodies in the hypothalamus and how they directly dive down their axons into the posterior pituitary. So then the posterior pituitary will will dump those hormones directly into that bloodstream as well. Okay, so now the next couple slides, like this slide and this slide, are going to talk through what hormones are being released where, but it doesn't really give you the why. So I'm going to go ahead and erase this. Just so that I can continue the flow chart up here. And we'll get to the why as we go through each individual organ throughout the rest of the chapter, throughout the rest of the semester. Some of these we'll cover in this chapter, but the majority we will cover throughout the rest of the semester. So don't panic if this doesn't all make sense now. It will, but slowly but surely. So for now, unfortunately, this is a little bit of a memorizing game as to where is coming, like what is coming from where, and what does that turn into, and then the why will come later. So let's go ahead and start with the posterior pituitary since there's less of that. The hypothalamus is going to be told either that it has, it will respond to either low blood pressure or labor, sex, love, I don't know, blah, 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 all that stuff. Okay. So if it responds to low blood pressure, we're going to release something called antidiuretic hormone. Diuretic hormone. So diuretics make us pee, so this is an anti-peeing hormone, excuse me. So this is going to help us hold on to water and thus increase blood pressure. The other one is oxytocin. And oxytocin is going to be released during labor. It's first released whenever baby kicks on the cervix, and then the cervix starts producing oxytocin, and then the uterus starts producing oxytocin, and then all of this goes back to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus is like, oh my gosh, we're in labor, okay, let's produce more oxytocin, and then this helps enlarge the diaphragm so that the baby can come out. Oxytocin is also involved in breast development for milk production. Oxytocin is also released during an orgasm. Oxytocin is also released during like the paternal and maternal bonding with babies and stuff. So there's all this other stuff that oxytocin can do, but for the purposes of this course, we only really focus on the positive feedback mechanism during labor. Okay, so let's go ahead and move to the anterior pituitary. So I'm going to take these one at a time in different colors so that you know what's paired with what. So let's go ahead and start with growth hormone. So anterior pituitary is going to make something called growth hormone. And as you can imagine, growth hormone is going to go to the rest of the tissues and tell it to grow. So in order for the anterior pituitary to make growth hormone, it's going to have to get something from hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is going to release either growth inhibiting releasing hormone, where it will not tell the anterior pituitary to make any more growth hormone, or it'll make growth hormone releasing hormone, where it will tell it to make more growth hormone. Okay. Next is, let's do prolactin. I'm just kind of choosing these arbitrarily. Prolactin hormone. Prolactin hormone is going to be released during, I think a week or two before labor, and thereafter, as long as the positive feedback mechanism is still in play, and prolactin, in order for prolactin to be released, the hypothalamus has to release either prolactin inhibiting hormone or prolactin releasing hormone. Okay, next let's do MSH. Oh, I'm sorry, not MSH. Let's do TSH. So the anterior pituitary will release thyroid stimulating hormone. As you can imagine, that'll go to the thyroid and tell it to make thyroid hormone. But in order for the anterior pituitary to do that, it will have to have a signal from the hypothalamus where it will release thyroid releasing hormone. Okay. Next, the anterior pituitary can release ACTH or no, that's not right, adrenocortical. I'm spacing on what ACTH stands for. Oh, good, and it doesn't tell you here. That's a bummer. There it is. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. I was almost there. Adrenocorticotropic hormone. This will go to the, this will go to the adrenal cortex of the adrenal glands and produce cortisol, which is in response to stress. And in order for the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, the hypothalamus has to release corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH. Okay, the next one, let's do in, I don't know what other color. I get so bogged down on which colors to pick. Okay. Okay, the next one is FSH and LH. And FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. And the other one is luteinizing hormone. And these will be released by the anterior pituitary to go to the gonads to promote follicular development, so either the spermatocytes or the oogonia, so sperm and egg, or the hypothalamus. And in order for this to happen, the hypothalamus has to release something called GnRH, and that N is a lowercase n on purpose, and that's gonadotropin releasing hormone, in order to tell the anterior pituitary to make FSH and LH. And then last but not least, we have, just want to make sure we went over all of these. Last but not least, we have melanocyte stimulating hormone. Melanocyte stimulating hormone. And in order for the anterior pituitary to release that, the hypothalamus has to release melanocyte releasing hormone. And melanocyte stimulating hormone will go to the skin and turn on melanocytes and ask them to produce melanin, and melanin's really important for our sleep cycles. Okay, that was a lot, Alexandra. What do I really need to know? Really everything that I've written down right here. So like I said, we'll talk in detail in this chapter. We'll talk a lot about growth hormone and thyroid hormone. For the reproductive system chapter, we'll talk about FSH and LH. For the urinary chapter, we'll talk about ACTH. So all these, and then for the urinary chapter, we'll also talk about ADH. So the rest will kind of run through the rest of the class, but for now, we're just introducing all of them and their pathways and where they're coming and going. And that's what all these slides say as well. So typically for this course, whenever we meet in person, we ask students to complete what we call a hormone table. And even though this looks kind of daunting and intimidating, it really pays off in the end. So it's not an assignment for the online course. However, I really still highly recommend that folks do this, and I'm going to post it in D2L so that you can download it if you'd like. And the idea of this table is for you to kind of go through each hormone, where it's released from, why it's produced, like where it's produced from, what stimulates it to be produced in the first place, where does it go after it's made, and then what are the effects whenever it's done, or whenever it finally gets to its target tissue. And there's quite a lot on this list, I understand that, but a lot of students, especially who go into the nursing program after this, they still rely on their hormone tables for any of their assignments and for them to kind of go back and review. So I highly recommend that you do this. We're not going to take this for a grade. I'm not going to be grading it this semester, but if you are interested in this, I highly recommend that you fill it out and use it to your benefit. Everything with a star is something that we introduce but then come back to later. So you might need to add on to it as the semester goes on. So that's what this asterisk means. Okay? If this table, or excuse me, if this flowchart wasn't useful for you, didn't make a lot of sense, there's plenty of others on the interwebs. I found a picture over here that just kind of gives you a simple rundown of everything that we went through. I really like this one, but like I said, there's plenty of others on the internet. So if you don't like the one we made, find another one. I highly recommend you find another one. We'll see you for the next one.